I'm Tamara Cherry, author of The Trauma Beat and host of The Trauma Beat. If you've watched the morning show, you likely already have a sense of how ruthless the business of network television can be. For this week's episode of The Trauma Beat, we head to New York City with someone who lived that business, was deeply impacted by that business, and wants to change that business. Here we go. Okay, so Elisa, why don't you start out by introducing yourself?
Sure. So my name is Elisa Toha, and I'm a trauma therapist based here in New York City. But the way that our paths crossed is that I'm also a former journalist, and I worked for over a decade, first for the network morning shows and then for Anderson Cooper at CNN.
Okay, so I will tell whoever's listening, watching this, I love Elisa. I think that we first connected, a couple of years ago, maybe. And every time I talk to you, it just fills my cup. And I'm so excited for this conversation. So, Elisa, why don't you just start out by telling us a little bit about your path to journalism?
Yeah. So I was actually at NYU when 9/11 happened. So that was my second week of school, and I watched the towers fall from outside my dorm. So
Wow.
that was, yeah, my first introduction into trauma. And I was an intern for a PBS documentary series at the time, and we made a documentary about a group of Stuyvesant high school students who went to school down by the towers. So that was really like the first time I sort of saw the way that journalism and storytelling could help process trauma, both personally and professionally.
And did you see it as a positive thing for the people involved in that documentary?
Yeah, at the time, for sure, both for them and for myself, sort of like
Mm.
this ability to put words to something that feels so indescribable and chaotic and overwhelming, right? And to sort of put it into narrative and in a way that connects you, right, with other people and people all over the world, right, all over the country. I think we felt that as New Yorkers, right, is that so many people were experiencing that with us, right, and were
Mm-hmm.
there with us through that.
Wow. Okay, Alyssa, before becoming a journalist, like let's just go back to even before you were in journalism school. What was your impression of the job? Because I'm curious as to whether this changed over time.
Yes. I think like, anyone else, I started out really idealistic, and especially in the sense that I thought I could choose the stories I would be able to tell and the way I would be able to tell them, right? I think like we all sort of go in with that hope. And then, it's a really competitive industry, especially in New York City, right? And I ended up at the morning shows first, where there was this element of like, for lack of a better word, sales that
Mm.
I wasn't prepared for. And I think, yeah, that really ended up taking a toll on me, especially for the
Mhm.
first 5 years of my career.
When you say sales, are you referring to actually like we need to get this for advertising dollars, or are you referring to the competitive aspect of the job?
Yeah, the competitive aspect of it's not only how you tell the story, right? But it's if you tell it first, or if you can like put an exclusive on it or break the story, which, as a booker, and, I ended up being a news producer, booker who traveled on breaking news stories. That was one of the biggest part of my job, biggest parts of my job would be to get to people first, right? And to put them on the air as soon as I could. Um,
So I want to talk about the role of the booker, but first I want to ask you, because you started this conversation by saying that, you are now in the mental health realm, but what sort of knowledge did you have around trauma before working with trauma as a journalist? Like, had you had any training for interviewing or working with trauma survivors? Did you take any courses when you were at NYU? Like, what was your exposure as a journalist working with trauma?
Yeah. So it's kind of shocking, but I had none, right? And I think what maybe would surprise people the most is that I think that that's often still true. And I think that's why you are doing what you're doing, which is trying to change that. I did not only, I mean, it's interesting. I was an English major, so that does sort of set me apart. I didn't go to J school. But as an English major, I had 4 internships in television by the time I started in the morning
Wow.
shows. And I, still didn't have any sort of formal training. And I remember actually my mentor at ABC telling me that as an intern at ABC, her job was to watch footage of 9/11 and log it, right, just for hours. And I was thinking, like, nowadays, right, I hope that we would understand the impact of that, right, on a person. But back then, I really don't think we did. I don't think trauma was the same, sort of buzzword or like known thing it is today.
Mhm.
Um, but we learned by being thrown out into the field, right? By shadowing older journalists, and just kind of learning as we went.
Mhm. Gosh, you saying that, like, it reminds me of, I don't know if I've told you about this in the past, but it reminds me of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine in the news business some years ago. There was, I'm not going to get into the details, but a very traumatic video that was very big in the news, even though we weren't showing the video, but journalists were watching it to like verify that what happened. I saw part of it and wish that I didn't. And I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who was in a senior role and asking, like, did you ever have to watch that video? And this friend said, like, oh God, no, I made the intern do it, or whoever it was. I was like, oh my God, like, oh gosh, this young person. I mean, nobody should have to watch that really, but to go in with that, like, just so that hits me in that, oh God, okay. So Elisa, booker, what is a
Mhm.
booker? Like, just describe for us a day in the life of a booker at one of these big network stations.
Yeah, so there's different kinds of bookers, right? There's entertainment bookers, political bookers, and I was breaking news. So that meant that anytime a story broke around the country or the world, I would get on a plane, usually within the first few hours if it was a major story, and fly to wherever the story was, to try to figure out, who were the main players, right? Who are the people who were there, and to get an interview with our anchors. So, whether it was Diane Sawyer, Robin Roberts, Anderson. I think a lot of people have the impression, like, don't people just come and like want to share their story? Yeah, like, usually we have to seek them out. And so that was my job, and pre-interview them, right? Talk to them first. Um, and then we were usually trying to turn around like a newscast for the next morning after something had a story had broken. So
Yeah, I mean, you're reminding me of, there's a young woman who's a survivor of mass violence who I talk about in my book, and she described, in the hours after this shooting happened, being in her home and her doorbell constantly ringing with journalists and people coming to her home with like leaving like bagels and or flowers with like their business card, like call me, like, and that would have been people like you, right?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That was me. Door knocking, which I think you call it something different, right? In
Yeah.
Canada. Is that or the
Well,
red?
I was actually just
Yeah.
talking to a British journalist too the other day. The death knock, the
Yeah.
door knocks. I refer to that when I was coming up. It was a pickup, but yeah.
Yeah, pick up. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, I would, and sometimes, it involved embedding within communities for weeks. So, you know, um, we would get out, you'd grab your go bag and get on a plane, and you could come back, within a couple of days. It could be a couple of weeks, and sometimes it was months. Like there was this time that I was up in Vermont
Really?
for a month. Yeah. If it was a competitive story, where the person wasn't ready to talk, but they didn't trust, right? Like sending someone away in case the person changed their mind.
So
Yeah.
what impact did that have on you, Alyssa? Because like near the beginning of our conversation, you're talking about, during an internship, doing a documentary with these kids about 9/11 and how healing that could be for them. But then here you are embedding in a community because you're trying to get an interview with somebody that doesn't want to talk. Like just describe what that is like.
Yeah. Yeah. It made me become a trauma therapist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you could
Seriously.
say it in one sentence. No,
Yeah.
no. Listen, there were so many stories I worked on, right? And I like always feel like I need to frame, there's still a part of me that feels like I need to frame it where, there were so many stories I worked on where I felt like I made a huge difference, right?
Yeah.
Like I was able to put words, right, to someone's experience, and they left feeling heard and connected, right, with so many people around the world. But yes, there were other times where I felt like this split, right, internally. And I think you talk about this a
For
lot in your
sure.
work. is this moral injury of what feels right and what I have to do for my job, right? And I think there was such a separation at a certain point, right, of how pushed down this other part and this other voice was, and the toll that that took on me. And if it's okay, I actually was thinking a lot about this and thinking of a story that really sort of illustrates the first time I felt that.
Yeah.
It was really like a year into my career. I was in my early 20s and I was at a morning show working the weekend shift. And, there was a lot of pressure if we missed a story, right? That could be big. And I remember my senior producer dropping the story on my desk and saying, just call this man and see if he'll talk. And it was a story about a man whose wife had died on his wedding day in this really tragic way. And I just remember thinking like, oh, I can't call him. This like just happened, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of stealing myself. We talked about sort of this lack of any training of sort of what to say to him, like hoping he wouldn't pick up the phone. And of
Mm-hmm.
course he did, and just his grief was so raw. And I remember being on the phone with him for an hour. He was sobbing, right? Like just like so fresh, right? And I remember hanging up and, I told him, listen, like, I know this is so new. If you ever want to share memories of your wife, like, here's my number. And I hung up. And then later that evening, I got this call from my boss and she was like, what happened? This man is coming up to New York. He's on our competitor tomorrow morning and they're teasing the segment. Like your note said he wasn't ready to talk. And I remember this like shame of,
Oh.
oh, like I didn't push hard enough, right? There was part of me that was like, oh, I'm a bad journalist, right? Like I didn't push hard enough. Like, what did I do wrong? And then this other part that was sort of horrified,
Uh-huh.
like,
Yeah.
oh, like, because it didn't feel good.
Yes.
And I remember waking up really early to watch the interview and it never aired. And I actually knew someone who worked for the show, the other show, and I called him up and he said that they had sent someone to that man's door. And they had promised this man like a trip to New York to see the studio, to meet the anchor, right? And he had gone up there and it turned out he wasn't ready, right?
Yeah.
And he couldn't go through with it. And I remember that was sort of the moment where I realized like either I can listen to this voice, right?
Yeah.
That's my voice, right? Like that I want all of my clients to be able to connect with, right? Is this
Mm-hmm.
internal compass of like what is right and what is wrong and what feels good. And then this outside noise and this outside pressure of what it means to be a good journalist,
Mm-hmm.
right?
But how do you, like, if you were talking to your younger self, because like so much of what you're saying there, Alyssa, and I know
Yeah.
you and I have chatted about this off air many times, I relate to so deeply. I have a million stories of exactly that, where you try and you try to get that pickup, that interview, that exclusive, though I've always hated the word
Mm.
exclusive on an interview with a grieving somebody. And they say they're not talking, and then either they do end up talking to somebody else and your boss comes up and like, what, you said they weren't talking. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
they weren't talking to me. I don't know what those
Yeah.
other people said. They were not ready to talk. Or they do end up talking, but it's clearly not a good interview. I think I might have told you the story
Yeah.
of when I was a young journalist and trying to get an interview with this cab driver who was involved in this deadly wreck where there was 3 teens that were killed. It was just awful. And I went to his apartment and his wife said like, no, like he can't even talk, like he's on pain medication. He can't communicate. Like, okay, here's my card. I left. And then just as I'm getting ready to file my story at, 5:30 or 6 o'clock, one of my supervisors comes up to me and says, I thought you said he wasn't talking, Global got him. Like, what? And I went back, and because that back in those days, they would record everything, I think on VHS in the newsroom. And we went back and watched it. And it was literally a clip of him lying in bed, like his arms were just saying, I hurt. Like that was it. That was the clip. So, but I know that feeling so bad. Like, oh my gosh, what did I miss? I'm
Yeah.
not a good journalist. So you say like you try now, and we're going to get into this because I want to talk to you about the work you do with journalists, but you try to get journalists to connect with that inner voice. But how feasible is that for a young journalist in New York, where like I was working in Toronto and had a boss tell me, there's 100 more people lined up outside the door waiting to take your job. I imagine that you would have been told there's like 10,000 people lined out outside the door ready to take your job. So how is it feasible for a young journalist to listen to their heart and
Yeah.
to just take no for an answer? as a young booker?
Yeah, no, it's like, it is close to impossible depending on the culture of the place you work, right? And I say this like with full realization that you can't be picky, right? Like that you can't choose. And I think that's what I sort of went back to is, right, this idea that you can choose the stories you tell and how to tell them, right? And the truth is you don't usually have that luxury in the first 5 or maybe even 10 years of your career, right? You sort of are where you are. And so I think the biggest shift for me, right, was when I left morning shows and I ended up with Anderson, and I realized like what was possible, right? Like it was possible to work, right, where your values aligned with your employers, right? Or it was possible to work in a place where, like, from the top down, there was like a deeper understanding of
Mm-hmm.
trauma and trauma-informed journalism, right? And so, yes, like it's not always possible where you work, but I think there's ways also to manage, right? Like I think there's ways to take care of yourself in a toxic culture. And I think it's very easy to get sort of sucked into that current, right? And put your
Mm-hmm.
work first and just neglect or forget, right? Like these
Mm-hmm.
other parts of you that are so important. And not only important for yourself, but like important for your employer as well, right? Which is sort of why you're arguing like how important this work is like to be a good journalist, you need to have connection with that passion that brought you into the field in the first place, right?
To want to
So
do good, to want to make a positive difference in the world. And it's interesting because like you just mentioned, you kind of can lose that part of yourself. And that's like how I think journalism really messes with you, because it tricks you into thinking, like, to questioning what makes a good journalist. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people, like, am I a good journalist because I convinced that grieving mother on the courthouse steps to talk? Or am I a good journalist because I don't try, because I know inside she already said she didn't want to talk? And some people, like, they would say that I was a really good journalist when I worked in Toronto because I could get that family to talk.
yeah.
Like, why they didn't talk to me? Why are they talking to you? I don't know, people just talk to me. But was I? Because actually I think that I caused more harm than good in a lot of those interviews that I think back on now, because I know they weren't ready to talk at the time. We'll be right back. So I know we're not naming names or anything in terms of the bad stuff you went through, but you did just mention the positive shift that came when you went to work for Anderson Cooper. Are you comfortable talking about that, Elisa, and what you learned in that environment? Like, how was it so different from some other environments you worked in?
Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot. That was really when I started getting interested in trauma, right? And sort of, they actually let me go back to school, right, to become a social worker while I was at CNN. Um,
Wow. Thinking that
yeah,
it would help you with your job.
well, no, actually,
Or
it was my amazing boss who knew, yeah, that I
oh,
had this
wow.
goal for the future, right? So I was doing both at the same time, which
Mm,
speaks volumes, right, about how much he valued his employees. But um, yeah, I was listening to Anderson's podcast on grief
mhm,
recently. I don't know if you've heard it, but it just like solidifies sort of like if there's anyone who could teach a master class, right, on
mhm,
trauma-informed journalism, it would be him. And I was trying to put my finger on, on the elements of like what makes it so powerful. And I think the biggest thing, which is also my learning growth as a therapist, is the way he slows down, right? The way he like slows down with people and is there with them without an agenda. Right. And again, like that's not always possible, depending on the outlet you work for.
mhm,
Um, but the way he sort of, there's just so much respect, right, in the way he sits down next to next to someone and shares their story. And I think, that has been huge, again, like professionally and personally, right, is that slowing down
mhm,
and really listening and holding space.
mhm. Yeah, and like you said, the not having an agenda is huge, because it sort of implies that you're not there to necessarily take something from
Yes.
somebody.
Yeah.
You're not going in there to just get that clip of them breaking down, or I need you to just say this and then I'll go away. It is, I mean, to be you know, have that trauma informed practice, you have to be centering that survivor and not centering yourself. So you can't have that agenda in that regard.
Yeah. 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 And I think like you see the way he guides his interviews in such a gentle way, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think I had the experience at morning shows, right? Where, yeah, it just like they had already written the segment before they sat down across from the person, right? Like, how often did you see that happen?
Wow.
Where
Like,
the script was written, right? And they're just looking to fill in the sound
oh my
bites, right?
gosh. So it
I
would,
mean,
I'm imagining it would be something like, and then the unthinkable happened, and now life will never be the same, and put in the clip. And yeah, there's really formulaic writing that you can fall into with that stuff. But it is like, then why do you even need to talk to this person?
yeah. And I'm not saying that's true of every,
Yeah.
you know,
No, but I
thing
can
that,
see how it would happen.
yeah. But I think another important thing to say though is that like to be trauma informed, I think like it has to be systemic, right? It has to like come from the top. I think like you can be a journalist and be trauma informed. And, especially as a booker, right? Like you can go and sit down next to someone and really like hold space for them and then go back to work and have the pressure, right, to cut it into a 3-minute piece,
Mhm.
to like fit it in between these other two segments, right? Like there's just
Mhm.
so many pressures that can completely water down what it means to be trauma informed.
For sure, absolutely. So, okay, so Alyssa, I want to go back to like when you're still in journalism, what made you want to leave? Because you aren't a journalist now. You support journalists as, you know, as a trauma therapist, but what made you want to leave? And I wonder, like, could you leave? Like, because it sounds like you had some pretty awful times. But what was there a straw that broke the camel's back? Was it a cumulative impact?
Yeah, I feel like it was cumulative. I think it was I really resonated with like Dan Harris wrote a book called
Mhm.
10%
Yeah, I
Happier.
read that.
So I really resonated with what he was saying sort of about just the speed at which, right, like you go through your career and how hard it is to slow down. And I think was going at such top speed. I think what made me such a good booker was my speed, right? And
Mhm.
I was just, ignoring so many other things at the expense of my career. My identity was so like closely woven with being a journalist.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like where it started somatically, right? Like I think like I would get these recurring migraines that would just like take me out for 2 days at a time.
Wow.
Um, and I like looking back, it was a lot of numbing behavior. It was like, oh, like I would be in these breaking news situations and then I would go home and not be able to turn off and like look for whatever could distract me or numb me or take me down, right? Like, and I think that's really common with journalists, right? There's a
Mhm.
lot of like, I'll just have a drink at the end of the day, or I'll like,
Mhm.
scroll social media or shop or whatever.
Mhm.
And I just think, yeah, there was a certain point where like my body and my mind couldn't
Mhm.
take it anymore. Um, and no, I couldn't leave for a long time financially. I think like most journalists don't get paid well enough, in New York City,
Well, and
you're
you're
leaving.
living in New
Yeah,
York. I can only
yeah,
imagine like how
yeah.
much like the cost of living would be compared to what you're making as not an on-air personality.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, I couldn't leave. And I think like part of the reason I could was eventually like attaining enough financial stability.
Mhm.
And then I ended up, at Anderson and I loved it, but it still felt right that there was something missing that like,
Mhm.
what I loved about my job really was something different, which was
Mhm.
holding space for these survivors and helping them after the
I
cameras left.
I feel like you and I don't remember if we've talked about this, Alyssa, before, but I feel like you can probably relate to this feeling. When I was a crime reporter, there were so many times that I just wanted to be able to just like cross that line from
Mhm.
journalist to just human being. And I just wanted to be able to go to a survivor and just hug them and say, like,
Oh,
what can I do for you? And how messed up is that like I felt like I couldn't, you know,
yeah.
because I had to, but I was like filing for the web, then filing for noon and filing for this, you know, this station and this and Radiohead and blah blah blah. And then you're just rushing towards that deadline, which is constant, that there's no time to just stop and just I just wanted so badly to be able to just go. And I guess that's where a lot of the moral injury comes in, right? you wanted to be able to really, you go into this career because you want to be able to help, and you feel like you are, because you're like, people need to know the impact of this shooting or this, you know, distracted driving or drunk, whatever it is, they need to know. But then it's like, I still felt like wanting for something more. Like and I'm not saying that journalists don't do enough. That's not what I'm saying. But I wonder if I was able to do my job right in a trauma-informed way, if I would have had that fulfillment that I was seeking. Like, I do feel like it would have been much different.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Do you feel the same with your
Yes.
experience?
Yes. And I remember feeling actually that it was towards the end of my career, I was sort of falling into this role of I don't know now as a social worker, right? I think of it as like a case planner, right? But someone who would kind of come and like, oh, try to connect them with like resources or what's, someone who's going through something traumatic needs in sort of those first few days,
Mm-hmm.
which now like I recognize as like really psychological first aid, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you need food? Have you had water, right? Like, do you
Yes.
feel safe? Like, and I think one thing I think a lot about is that in the first few days, like especially after, a school shooting or a natural disaster, how there's this craving for information, right? These people are looking for information and
Yes.
many times they don't have access to it. And
Yes.
we as journalists do, right? We have the press release, or we know when the press conference is happening, right? Or we know, like sort of all these
So true.
resources. And so I was acting as this like conduit, in a way where I was like, oh, I'm spending like, a lot of time doing these things that really are not, I don't
Uh-huh.
know if I'm supposed to be thrilled, right? Like, so, but that's where I got the enjoyment, or that's where it felt
Yes.
right,
Yes. But did you also feel like, because like I would do the same sorts of things, but then I feel like sometimes I also felt like if I'm being honest, when I reflect back, was I also doing those things just to like get the interview? Because
Well,
ultimately that is the goal.
I
You're
was
not
just
going to
gonna,
talk to those people unless like you're trying to get the interview. You're not going
yes,
in there as community volunteer.
yes,
You're
exactly.
there with FEMA and, no, like
Oh,
you're there as a journalist. And so it's kind of, that's one of the like brain, how it messes up your brain, because it's like, I'm helping, but are my intentions pure?
yeah.
Because
And
I
should
am
I be
helping,
the one doing this? No. And the
yeah,
answer is no. Like, I think
yeah.
that's what you and I feel so strongly about is like, yes,
Mhm.
it is not right that a family is getting their information from someone who wants
Yes.
something from them in return, right?
Yes.
And
It leaves them
so,
so vulnerable to exploitation.
so we go back to like this wide void of like, and a need, right? Of actual trained, like, person, a victim
Yeah.
service provider reaching a family before the media descend, right? Before
Yes.
the cameras show up on the lawn.
How, how, like, how reasonable is that though, Elisa, considering when you think about your time, how quickly you would fly into a community? Like, how
Yeah.
quickly would victim services, like I still want to demand it, because I totally agree with you. We've talked about this a lot, that there needs to be somebody there before, but like they need to fill that void. But then I think journalists also need to agree that, okay, we're stepping back until we know. It's like agreeing not to contact somebody until we know they've been notified by official means. It's like, maybe we should agree to not contact somebody until we know they actually have a support person there with them that can help them make a really like informed decision about whether or not they want to engage with the media. But
Yeah.
there's so much that is missing there. It's interesting though, like when you say, giving resources and stuff like that. So two things come to mind. First, I always think about Amy C. O'Neill, who is a Boston Marathon survivor and also a mental health professional. And she told me, like when I was researching my book, trauma is the absence of a narrative.
Mm.
And that made me like, so a couple things. So first of all, it just made me realize how effed up our job is, that we're trying to get a narrative from somebody who literally, if their brain is on trauma, literally like might not even have a narrative to share. They don't know what's going on. They can't piece it together. If they do talk to you, chances are you might get some inaccurate information. But then it also made me realize that, like, from that perspective, like they don't know what's going on. So we should be giving them stuff. And this is the other thing that it made me think of. I was talking to a journalism like leader at one of the big journalism schools in Toronto recently, or listening to him speak, and he said that they send out all their J school students with like, who are going to talk with vulnerable people or trauma survivors or whatever, with like a pamphlet of here's a list of
Oh,
services that
wow.
you can connect with. And I was like, that's amazing,
Yeah.
because to have that ready, all these social services, because it's not our job, but it is
Yeah.
a recognition that there is such a gap there. And this
Yeah.
is a way that we can help you. Anyway, okay. So Elisa, you are now a therapist who specializes in supporting journalists. Why? I mean, it might seem obvious, but why was that important to you?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I started off studying trauma thinking that I would be working with people who had experienced single incident, like big T trauma,
Mm-hmm.
that we covered, right? So
Mm-hmm.
shootings, kidnapping, all the stuff, natural disasters, right? And I realized the impact of the small T trauma, and the way in which it impacts our nervous system, right? And
Mm-hmm.
just
You're
sometimes
talking about like
more.
vicarious trauma,
Yeah,
moral injury,
certainly,
or
yeah,
secondary
vicarious
trauma.
or
Mm-hmm.
right, yeah, or from family of origin, right? Sort of
Right.
some, and a lot of these things where you sort of think like, "Ugh, like that's not trauma, like compared to, right, the
Yep.
woman who lost her kids, right? In this, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think as journalists, we do that a lot, right? We kind of like, this is nothing, like,
Yes.
and we see the worst of the worst,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Who
so
am
in
I to suffer? My family is complete. I live in a safe neighborhood. I'm,
yeah,
I'm able to pay my bills. There's so many things. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and we push it down and we like, kind of there's like, and like I said, I love parts work, right? Because there's a part of us that just sort of like discounts all of that, right? Or like numbs it or puts it away, until it sort of comes into the forefront, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I found like that was my passion is, yeah, working with people and, and that involves a lot of different professions, right? There's so many professions that sort of require us to do that type of like compartmentalization to
Mm-hmm.
do a good job.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
thinking about first responders,
Yes, absolutely.
doctors, nurses, so many.
Yeah.
Okay, so considering your time as a journalist and now how like you're working with journalists in the mental health field, what is your impression of how journalists are doing mentally, and what impact the job has on them?
Yeah. Well, like given the state of the world, right, I think a lot of people's mental health
Mm-hmm.
are, is not doing so well. But for journalists in particular, I think, we talk about again that speed, right, of breaking news, and how we sort of go into the state of, fight or flight, right? This like sympathetic nervous system of just like survival.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like, yeah, that's in many ways, that's what's exciting about the job. And a lot of people are really good at that. But then again, like the toll that that has of living in that constant state, on your body, on your mind. I think of a lot of the clients I see have, whether it's stomach issues or like back
Mm-hmm.
pain, migraines, like I
Mm-hmm.
had, right? And sort of they're manifesting in these other ways. It's like Bessel van der Kolk, right? The body keeps the score.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
It's so true. And I'll say like one of the most helpful things, there was a lot that I got from therapy that was very helpful for me, but I think like one of the biggest light bulb moments for me and just validating moments was when my therapist actually like took out a piece of paper, because we were having a discussion about me potentially going on medication, because as much as I had had these breakthroughs in through my therapy, I still was having like these like extreme
yeah.
sort of physical reactions. And she took a piece of paper and she's like, this is a normal person's brain, like a stress response. This is yours. Like, you cannot, like, you literally,
Yeah.
like, you're up here. And when you do this so many times over so many years, like so many times a day over so many years, you're like, your ability to handle stress stays up here. It becomes harder and harder to bring it down. So I ended up going on meditation, should be doing more
Also
meditation,
good.
medication. Exactly. I went on medication, and it helped me, because it helped me bring that like, and I was able to like explain to my kids that I actually injured my brain. So when like my son went through a stage, sometimes he still is there, but all about violence, he's 9 years old now. When he was 8, like, oh, gory, I'm an evil clown and blah, blah, blah. And he would always talk about this. And finally I said to him, like, stop. Like, you remember what my job used to be? Like, yeah, you were a reporter. I'm like, well, what you might not have realized because you were so young at the time is that I only reported on bad news. I was a
Yeah.
crime reporter. I only reported on the bad stuff. And actually only talking about bad stuff all the time and seeing bad stuff and, hearing bad stuff, that actually injured my brain. It actually changed my brain to the point that I need to take medication every day for it. And he sort of went like, oh, but it's true. And then you talk about the other stuff, like in the body keeps the score. Yes. Anybody who wants to learn about trauma, read Dr. Vessel van der Kolk. Absolutely. We'll be right back. So Elisa, like what needs to change? Like there's a million things I think both of us could agree on, but what changes are necessary and like feasible, would you say, in the way that we tell these stories? I should say in the way that we gather and tell these stories, because it's like, it's two different things that can have two, many different problems.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think it needs to be like a cultural shift, right? And there needs to be like a systemic shift in how we talk about mental health, right? And how we talk about journalists, taking care of themselves and the people they interview. But I think, I mean, I was sort of thinking about if you were a company and you dealt with hazardous waste, right? You would give your employees preventative, right? Like training, protective gear. If they all came down with the same symptoms, there would be an acknowledgement and treatment, right? And it's not so much of a stretch to say that there's many news organizations that deal with, right, like selling traumatic material, right? Or like in some way, potentially, and I should use the word potentially traumatic material. And there's so many employees that are just immersed in it. I just think of like just being fire hosed. That's how I felt at the morning. You're just sort of fire hosed with this information day and night, whether you're watching tape or whether you're in it and witnessing it in person. And what needs to change, is like exactly that. There needs to be preventative work done, right? Like mandatory trainings. I really feel passionately about that. Mandatory trauma trainings. And then, follow up, like it has to be part of the conversation. It has to be like, wow, like you just spent, a couple of weeks covering the story. How are you doing? Right. And like at the bare minimum, it's providing, the access to weekly trauma-informed therapy, right? And ideally groups. I think there should be like group processing.
Peer support, like peer support, you mean? Yep.
Yeah, with journalists processing what they've been through. And then, there's people doing really cool things. I talked to you briefly about it before air, but there's someone called the News Yogi. And she does like sort of mindfulness and, teaching journalists about yoga. And I have to say, as a journalist, I don't know if you felt this way, but I felt very like allergic to the idea of slowing down and breathing.
Oh,
right?
for sure.
Like, yoga. Like I was like, oh, like I think that would have been the biggest eye roll.
Yes, for me,
Right.
absolutely too. Yes.
But I needed it so badly,
Yes.
and I think that sort of like speaks to all of my modalities I use in trauma therapy have some element of mindfulness and meditation, right? And I might not hit you over the head with it and be telling you to breathe, but it's going to be incorporated into the work that we do.
Well, like you said, like going back to Dan Harris's 10% happier, like just the value of that slowing down and being mindful. And like you could not get me in a yoga studio for anything when I was working as a journalist. And I would sweat out my stress, like I needed those like high impact workouts, spinning. I'd be like crying sometimes on the bike, like getting it up. And I felt like that was therapy for me. No, it wasn't. Like what I realize now is what I really needed was and I don't know how this would be possible, but like in my day after having that highly emotional interview with that grieving parent, I needed to be able to go in my car and just sit and just like, and just think about the fact, like just process in my mind what was just said, because when you're sitting there, you're just like, okay, we got to get this shot. She just mentioned this, got to get that picture, blah, 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 blah. Like, oh, I need to remember to follow up with this, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
And you're also being an empathetic person. You're also kind of feeling those emotions with them, and your brain's going a million miles an hour, but then you realize that you're crying too. And you're like, what's going on? And then you're just running to the truck and you're banging out the script. And what we really need is that time. Like, how helpful would that be? I heard a police officer actually talk about that does a lot of this work with first responders, talk about just you know, after you go to a call where there's like a child injury or child death or something like that, and you go back to your cruiser and you just like say, you know, like that happened to another family. It didn't happen to mine. It's like awful that it happened to them. But, you know, and this is what I heard and this is what I saw. And it's just a matter of taking even 60 seconds, as insignificant as that sounds. But isn't it crazy that when you're in it, Elisa,
Oh,
you can't imagine finding even 60 seconds?
no.
Can't
And
stop. You're literally
one of
eating while you're doing things like,
you forget to eat. I was, how
yes.
many times have I forgotten to eat or
Oh, that's
drink?
why I packed my lunch every day, because it's the only way that I
Yes,
would eat on the go,
yes.
literally in my car.
Yeah. And I remember one of my best friends in journalism was telling me that when she covered Sandy Hook, she had advice from a cameraman there who said, if there's one piece of advice I can give you, it's to take the time to grieve while you're here. Like, don't
Mm,
wait. Like, don't push it down. Don't like say, oh, I'll feel this later. Right. And like how powerful that is, right? Like
mhm.
that you are in the middle of this story and yet you don't even have the time, right? To
Yeah.
really like even stop like for a minute and think about it. Yeah, it's just, ugh.
Thank you for sharing that, because that is so powerful. But then it also like, it brings to mind for me another difficulty of journalists, because I think about, you know, a colleague that I used to work with who covered Sandy Hook as well as a truck operator, and him telling me, you know, that they were down there for, I don't even know. I think after 2 weeks or something, he said that people started like holding up signs and yelling at the media, like, go away. So if you're there, like it just, again, it's that contradiction of feelings that you, even if you're there and you're trying to take care of yourself and you're grieving, you also are there to you have a job to do. And there's community that's like, go away.
Yeah.
You've
Yeah.
overstayed your welcome, you
Yeah.
know? And I guess, I mean, that's part of the conversation, right? It's time to go
Yeah.
away. Like we need to recognize that. Um, you've spoken about wanting to support trauma survivors with the media. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this is sort of how we came together, our shared interest in doing this. In an ideal world, what would that sort of work look like for you, supporting trauma survivors with the media? Like what role would victim service providers play? What role would newsrooms play? What role would law enforcement play? What is your ideal outlook on that?
It's tricky. It's a hard question. And it's one that I've thought a lot about. And I think sort of the best case scenario, the best case is that there'd be some sort of funding, right? Where we could do a lot more. But I think even the idea of having information in one place,
Mm,
which actually your website does really beautifully, right? Is like, here's
thank you.
a place you can click, right, and get the information you need, right? Like in the first few hours or a few days. And I think about the comparison in the mental health world, right? And I used to work for a child advocacy center,
Mm,
where it was multidisciplinary, right? We had like NYPD on the first floor, and
mm,
there were social workers, and there was an assistant district attorney, right? Like, and all of these major players in one building who like collaborated and worked
mhm.
to help victims. And I feel like that would be so beautiful, right? If there was even just one website that you could sort of direct people to, and it would have the information and the way to connect to these
Mhm,
different people. That's so needed after the
mhm.
first, in the first few days
Do
of a big.
there was a when I worked in Ontario, the Ministry of the Attorney General, I remember at one point they had, I don't know if they still do, they had a handout like on their website. Um, it was on their website, or maybe homicide investigators would actually hand it out to like family members, like this is what to do in your time of grieving. And I think that there were tips about the media on there. And I found this out like years ago when I was starting to research this kind of thing. And I remember going and talking to homicide investigators, like, so like, don't you have a handout that you can give? And they're like, oh, we don't give that. Like nobody looks at that stuff. Like,
In some
do you
ways,
think
yeah.
that it's like, it is like really the bare minimum, right? Directing people to a
Yeah, it
website,
is
but
fair.
even like, how sad is that though, that we're
Yeah.
suggesting that as something that should be done, because it should be so
Yeah.
obvious.
I know. I
Hey, but
know.
like what else? Because we know that somebody who has just experienced that traumatic event, are they even in a state where they can like go
Yeah.
on a website? Are they
Take
going
in
to take that piece of
information.
paper
Yeah.
and get information when the media is knocking at their door? Like it just feels so insufficient, you know?
Yeah. No, and ideally it would be a human, right? Like
Yes.
ideally
Yeah.
Yes, like ideally a victim service provider or someone, who is trained ideally in both, trauma and the media,
For sure.
um, could show up and be there physically. I think
Yeah.
that is important. And again, why journalists sometimes end up being invited into the home and like, getting these interviews because it's the human connect, like people
Mm,
after a big event like that are sort of longing for that
right.
human connection of like someone to hold their story and their experience and help them, yeah, like
Hmm.
order food or whatever these basic things that you need after something terrible.
Hmm.
Yeah, so yes.
Um, it's funny because it sort of like brings us full circle to at the beginning when you were talking about that documentary you did after 9/11 and how therapeutic that was for everybody involved, the journalists, the interviewees. And it just speaks to the power of how amazing these stories can be, how powerful these stories can be if we just do them right, if we allow survivors to, if we just sit with them and just allow them the time that they need. And that doesn't necessarily mean just like pausing and letting them speak, but maybe pausing for a couple months, maybe
Yeah.
pausing for a year, pausing until they're actually ready to talk. What do going back to your work with journalists, you talked about listening to your body. What do you advise people for self-care? Like what should any journalist that covers trauma be
Yeah.
doing? I recognize that it can look different for different people, but do you have any tips that um, you would give to journalists or employers? Is it all about that, just checking in? How are you doing? Or are there other things that you encourage?
I mean, I do think like what is important to name is relevant to this is that right trauma impacts people in different or sorry, it's not the event itself that's traumatic, right?
Mm,
Like it's whether it overwhelms our capacity to cope. And we're
mm,
all so different and so unique. And that's as a, someone who survived an event or is covering it, right? It impacts us all in different ways. So I think what's important in about that slowing down is actually listening to what is the impact? What do I need? And that answer will be different for every single person, right? Who's experienced the same event.
mhm,
And honestly, that's why I think therapy is so important, right? Is that there's a lot you can do on your own.
mhm.
But there's a lot that you really do want someone to, with knowledge to hold space for you and to look at you as a unique individual who's had unique experiences in your own life up until that point, right? To
Yes.
really understand, yeah, help you put the pieces together and empower
Mhm,
you to come up with that answer on your own,
mhm.
right? I think like the real answer is it depends on the
It could be
person.
within. It's so interesting we're talking about this right now, Alyssa, because just last night, like my husband's a graphic designer. He works at that thing behind me there. He is working right now on like he's helping a company create this educational program that teaches therapists how to work with first responders. So it's very similar to
Yeah.
like what you're doing and everything. And I was sort of listening to part of the course last night because he had to listen to come up with this information for a graphic. And this psychologist or psychiatrist, whoever was talking about this, was saying to the mental health professional, when you're sitting and listening to somebody's traumatic story and you react to it, like it's normal for us to react, for our reactions like to go up and then we come back down and then up and come back down because you're listening, you're an empathetic person, you're listening to their story and it's like, oh my gosh, that must be awful. But if you're listening and it goes up and you can't really bring it back down, then you need to question, where is that feeling coming from? Are you feeling hurt? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling angry? And is this feeling a reaction to something that was just disclosed to you? Or is it actually a reaction to something you experienced in your own life? And reminding yourself of this feeling. And I think that I thought that was just, I actually didn't think about it when I was listening last night. I didn't think about it in respect of, like through the lens of a journalist, but now hearing you say that, it just makes such sense. Like because we are human. We're human. We have our own experiences too. And something
Yeah.
might impact you beyond just the awfulness of that person's situation. It might be bringing something up for you too. So like, thank you for sharing that, Alyssa, of just listen to yourself, listen to your body, tune in with
Yeah.
yourself. Um,
Easier said than done, right?
what's that? What's that?
Easy, easier said than
Yeah, I
done.
know, right? Especially when you're thinking about, okay, I got to get the shot. I got to, but it's very like a journalist job is very different than a therapist job, but also so similar in many respects, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share that you'd like people to understand, Elisa, about trauma or about journalists, about bookers, about any of the stuff that we've talked about?
Um, I think, yeah, it really just goes back to sort of how unique everyone is, right? Like I was thinking about that. Yeah, what do I want people to know about journalists, right? Is sort of the same thing I want people to know about trauma, right? Is that,
Mm-hmm,
yeah, we're all unique, right? We're all, and like you just said, we all have our own experiences outside of our identity as a journalist that
mm-hmm,
impacts our ability to, sit across from someone and hold space for someone. So yeah, it's just sort of, yeah, slowing down enough to listen,
mm-hmm.
I guess. Yeah, it'd be like what I would want to leave everyone with.
I love that. And thank you to anybody who's just slowed down and listened to this conversation because
Mhm.
Alyssa, you have brought humanity to a job that, like, especially talking about your profession as a booker. I think that is like this stereotypical what people would consider what you're describing, the vulture, the ambulance chaser. I've heard the same things for me in my job, but you're a living human being with a beating heart that cares. Um, and I just so admire you for the work you're doing to try to change this and to try to help people who are in that profession because you recognize the humanity in them. And I know you feel such a responsibility, like as a caretaker for them because you've lived it. And I can relate to that. And so thank you for the work you do, Alyssa. And thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. And what another cup filling conversation with Elisa
Oh,
Toha. I just love every time I talk to you. Thank you so much.
thank you for having these conversations.